future of the Eurozone, if you posed this question a couple of years ago, would have looked bleak. But already I'll give you one of my conclusions, which is that it's over the worst. For the Brits in the audience, Humpty Dumpty may well have been put back together, belying the original metaphor there. But I think it's useful to start with some of the background about the things that were going wrong, which is essentially that the design of economic and monetary union, you might call it EMU1, wasn't sufficient to deal with what it was supposed to do. And there are all kinds of explanations of this, but the bottom line on this is that the toolkit for running EMU simply wasn't adequate. And a large part of what's been going on since then is to try to create mechanisms for running economic and monetary union which are better than those that were there in the past. Now this is seen if you look at what was going wrong. The reason for calling it pathologies is that there's no single explanation for what was wrong. There is first a crisis of debt. That crisis of debt manifests itself in different ways in different member states. In Greece, hope there are not too many Greeks in the room, the dysfunctional public sector was the root of all of this. A public sector which simply couldn't deliver without ever expanding debt. It probably dates from Stuart's friend Andreas Papandreou in the early 1980s when he ramped up debt. He created expectations, a kind of clientelistic approach in which successive Greek governments could only be elected by promising things to their supporters, which added to the debt burden. But in other countries, the debt issue was much more in the private sector. If you consider what happened in Spain or in Ireland, it was a crisis in the banking sector occasioned by excessive and imprudent borrowing going on to fund the property market. And that's a very different phenomenon from what we find in Greece, even though the common thread is the debt. It follows that what we're trying to do now is to find a way out of these high levels of debt, which are weighing on both the public sector and the private sector in different ways. And we discussed some of this yesterday afternoon in one of the previous tournaments. But the second concern is competitiveness. What economic and monetary union didn't have was a way of redressing the competitiveness differences that were emerging. And to give you one throwaway statistic, between 2000 and 2008, in other words, before the crisis, the relative unit labour costs of the southern European countries, not just Greece or Portugal or Spain, but also Italy, rose by something of the order of a quarter relative to German unit labour costs. Now, over year by year, that didn't look like very much, but when it accumulates over 8 years, that's a huge hit to the competitive position of those economies. There wasn't an easy way of redressing it, and it can be explained by the fact that the windfall gains of economic and monetary union meant that the public debt burden in those countries diminished radically. Italy in 1996 was paying 12% interest. Within 3 years it was paying 6% interest. With a debt in excess of 100% of GDP, you can see the windfall gains at that occasion. So what's being discussed now is how to redress this. And it's why you see so much effort put on innovation, research and development, reform of labour markets, whatever you might think about whether the labour market reform is necessary. This is the direction in which the economic governance change is going. Then, at a more macroeconomic level, the imbalances that everybody talks about, which have led to the new macroeconomic imbalances procedure at European level. Some countries are dominated by exports. Sweden, obviously, the Netherlands, not to mention a certain other large country. Some countries are dominated by consumption, or by the public sector. And these lead to imbalances where the consumers lead, the public sector leads, or the exporters lead the economic policy discourse. And yet we have the curiosity that in the euro area as a whole, its external position is more or less zero. The euro area is neither in surplus nor in deficit vis-a-vis the rest of the world. That has huge imbalances internally, with Greece having had a balance payments deficit reaching as high as 17% of GDP, and nobody noticed, or nobody did anything about it in 2008. Germany having a public balance payment surplus of 5, 6, 7%, the Netherlands even bigger. Now that kind of imbalance inside the monetary union like the UK or the US isn't noticed. It nets out. But inside the euro area, where the dominant policy levers are held by the individual countries, that does matter. And that was one of the distinct pathologies of the euro area. So what we have next is, at the heart of the crisis, the following paradox. Seen from the outside, if you're a Chinese investor or an American commentator on Europe, what you see is indecision, an inability to get anything moving. And yet, if you look behind the scenes, a bit like a duck swimming in water serenely, beneath the water, much was going on. And if you look at some of the things that have gone on over the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years now, you see a frenetic pace of governance reform in, first, what David Cameron once felicitously called the bazookas. The huge funds that were created at very short notice, about 3 years now, with the European Financial Stabilisation Mechanism and the European Financial Stability Facility. These were the 2 great pots of money assembled over a weekend in May 2010 to rescue the system. It didn't exist before. We've seen 4 explicit bailouts. Greece twice, Portugal, Ireland and Cyprus. We've seen the Greek, what's called PSI, or private sector initiative, where a write-down of debt occurred. The Spanish banks have been promised money from the new European Stability Mechanism. You need a degree in acronyms to follow any of this, by the way. The new European Stability Mechanism was a 2-line treaty change introduced to secure a new permanent fund for dealing with crisis resolution. That didn't exist before. So you can see there on the cash side, a range of changes taking place at European level designed to diminish problems. Then, to reflect both the fiscal indiscipline and the many different kinds of macroeconomic imbalance that I already mentioned, yet another range of things. The 6-pack comprised two elements of the 6-pack are a reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. One for the preventative mechanism, one for the corrective mechanism. Similarly, 2 for a macroeconomic imbalances procedure. And then there were other elements of fiscal discipline introduced in the rest of the 6-pack, including the obligation for any country to introduce the equivalent of a German debt brake, some sort of either constitutional or very, very strong rule inside the country. And all of this coming together in the fiscal compact, Europe 2020 strategy for structural policies, a huge range of changes in financial regulation, all being introduced simultaneously, culminating in the single supervisory mechanism. And then in governance, the creation of something called the European semester, which we're just finishing, which have just finished last week, in which the first go at understanding economic policies in any country, it's for me, I'm busy. First go at having change in any country is at the European level, which vets the plans that are put forward at national level. And in the second semester, it's working out the details. Now, this is a big shift of power. The European Council setting itself up as a de facto high-level economic government at European level, even though it doesn't deal with all the things that have to be done. And many, many crisis summits designed to save the euro. Now what we're seeing is a range of moves which are under this heading of genuine economic and monetary union towards banking, fiscal, political, and other kinds of union. So this is governance transformation on a massive scale, despite the image and the paradox that nothing's been happening. Now this leads me to ask an obvious question. And I have a number of potential answers which I'll skate over quickly. The first is gains. In all these things that have to be changed, the first gain is inside a member state. Angela Merkel may have a good idea of what might be needed at European level, but she has to persuade German public opinion. She has to deal with the constraints of the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the Constitutional Court, of Bild Zeitung, and so on, of her right wing, CDU. So that has to change first. Then you get games going on between member states. We've seen them being played out over the last year or two, with Hollande coming to power in France and saying what we need is a compact for growth and jobs. Well, they threw in that particular bone at the June European Council last year, and I defy anybody in the room to tell me what actually resulted from it. But that bone was thrown to them. And then a third level of games is taking place between different institutions. In particular, the ECB is pivotal here, because what the ECB has done is has come into the game when it's had to, when it's been the only option left, pumping in liquidity in different ways. And then it says to the finance ministers, right, we've done our bit, over to you, you do the next stage. And the finance ministers say, well, okay, we'll try. And then Berlusconi says, well, why do I need to? Because we have the long-term refinancing operations suggested by the ECB, therefore I can take the foot off the accelerator on structural reforms. So that kind of game is going on simultaneously with institutions as well as member states. My second explanation owes something to Klaus Goetz, who has written about political time, where I think what you see going on is politicians necessarily having to take longer to deal with this than we would like. Partly because of the games, partly because they have to go through due process. You can't enact something like a treaty change without national ratification. So even something as simple as the two-line treaty change which gave us the European Stability Mechanism had to go through due process. The catch here is that political time is very different from market time. Markets expect solutions by yesterday. They say, you met in the European Council, why don't we see the results tomorrow morning? Or even yesterday morning, because we should anticipate it. And market pressure has been a phenomenal element in this entire story. Then, just to state the rather blindingly obvious, there are various constraints in what different institutions at European level are able to do. We are not the USA. We're not heading even in the direction of the United States of Europe. Instead, we are still struggling to work out what the finalités are. Finalité économique or finalité politique. We don't yet know where we want to end up with this process of reform. And that too gets in the way of clear-headed thinking about the next steps to be taken. I would sum up much of this by saying that much of what's been going on has been a difficult enterprise in working out who picks up the bill. How do you share the burdens of adjustment, the necessary adjustment that has to take place for the degree of change that's occurring in Europe? Now let's look at banking briefly as a particular problem. We know it started with the banks, whether it's subprime banks in the US or Lehman Brothers or some other explanation. The banking sector is at the origin of much of the crisis. But it's only the origin because it gets then integrated in other ways which are not necessarily to do with banks. The banking problem exposed other weaknesses of governments. But still, what we saw in the early stages was a credit crunch. And as part of that credit crunch, what banks were doing was retreating inside their own borders, national borders. The cross-border interbank market simply froze in Europe, and that aggravated the problems of sovereign debt funding, which were already there. There's clearly a problem of these toxic links. In Ireland, the problem was with the banks. An Irish Prime Minister, who probably deeply regrets it now, promised to guarantee bank deposits. That shifted the burden from the bank's balance sheets to the state's balance sheet. Same sort of thing happening in Spain, and to some degree in the UK, where it's been very cleverly hidden by the Treasury, so that we don't actually know that the debts of the Royal Bank of Scotland are in fact hidden away in some sort of Samsung account that nobody can unravel. And what this creates is populism. It makes it very difficult to persuade populations that dealing with banks, who are the causes of this, is something that's necessary to redress the position. We've seen over the last few weeks what might appear to be an arcane debate about how you deal with failing banks. It became exposed, very exposed, to the Cyprus debacle, where a tiny little bank, Laiki Bank, had to be resolved, had to be closed down in a way which didn't do too much damage. And yet, the Cyprus crisis, remember that Cyprus is 0.2% of European GDP, seemed at one point being capable of bringing down the euro as a whole because we couldn't work out the best way of doing it. Now, in dealing with a bank, there's really only four categories of potential payers. There's the shareholders. They tend to get wiped out first. There's the bondholders in the bank. There's the depositors in the bank. And there's the taxpayers. Which one do you want to pick for this? Well, in the case of Cyprus, because the depositors were questionable Russians, the Germans said, well, we can't use German taxpayer euros to pay for questionable Russian depositors. And then they did it in such a cat-handed way that it came out as hitting small depositors in Cyprus. So a Cypriot granny with 10,000 euros savings and the Russian oligarch with 10,000 euros in an account to pay for the oil bill for his super yacht would be hit in exactly the same way. That was quickly abandoned because it was foolish. But it exemplifies the kinds of difficulties you have in dealing with this. Now the drift seems to be, how can we protect taxpayers from future bailouts of banks? And the answer is gradually to pay in money to create a fund to enable banks to be resolved in the future. That takes time. You have to accumulate it over 10 years because banks have been so severely weakened over the last 4 or 5 years. Do you use automatic means? This is a variant on the rules versus discretion idea. Do you have an automatic bank resolution, or do you allow discretion so that banks operate under a degree of uncertainty? They don't quite know whether they'll be resolved. And that's supposed to help in mitigating risks. One of the phenomena in banks was taking undue risks because you knew there was an implicit taxpayer guarantee. The expression too big to fail means big enough to milk the taxpayer. That's the trouble with it. So we're back to what one former member of the Federal Reserve Board called, Jerry Corrigan, called constructive ambiguity. Central banks should never quite let the market know whether they will intervene or not. The lender of last resort function has always been subject to this constructive ambiguity component. But the result of all this uncertainty about banks transmits itself to the real economy. And if we wanted resolution of the banks and clarity on the banks to occur, and we don't have it, this is one of the reasons why growth or confidence is so hard to engender. Now, another thing to notice here, which I just found in some statistics, you probably can't quite see the labels on the countries, because it's either all the labels or bigger text. But these are DG ECFIN's estimates of fiscal rules as were in place in 2008. Fiscal rules are things like, do you have a balanced budget obligation, or do you restrict deficits to 3% as in the Stability and Growth Pact? Do you have a golden rule, as Gordon Brown supposedly did at one point? All sorts of fiscal rules which are designed to restrain the deficit bias of governments. Now, what's intriguing about this, for those that can read it easily, is the countries at the bottom with the least fiscal rules, reading up the line, are Cyprus, Greece, Malta, Ireland, Romania, and Portugal. Anybody notice a connection with the bailouts? Italy's next. So if you've got your money in the Italian system, be worried. And the countries at the top, although they include the UK and Spain, tend to be those with the stronger fiscal systems. So it suggests that there is something about fiscal rules that is significant in forestalling crisis of this sort. Now, those who believe that there ought to be fiscal choice will rebel at this kind of assertion, but I leave that on the table for you to consider. Now, you do remember George Bush the First, don't you? He at one point used this statement. He was lying. He said, no new taxes, and then promptly raised them. But there's another George Bush the First successor, these two. What was transformative was Mario Draghi's statement in London last year, about just over a year ago, where he said, we are going to do whatever is necessary to safeguard the euro. And at a stroke, markets responded. They recognized that things were going to change and said, fine, We will reduce the spreads, afflicting Spain and Italy. And that took a lot of the heat out of the euro problems. Now the question at this point is it enough? And what will it take genuinely to keep the lid on all of this? And this is where genuine economic and monetary union comes in. A lot of people laugh at the expression genuine. If it wasn't genuine before, what was it? How do you translate genuine into German or French? Do they mean the same thing in these other languages? These are sorts of questions. But genuine economic and monetary union is the flavour of the month. It started off in the four presidents' reports last autumn. Four presidents being Van Rompuy, Barroso, I think it was Schulz at the time, and Draghi. Or could have been Budry. I can't remember the European Parliament. No, Buzek. Yes. So the four presidents' reports suggested that we need the following elements to make economic and monetary union function better. It was also endorsed or expanded in a European Commission document called Blueprint for Genuine Economic and Monetary Union. So there's a large amount of pressure now emerging to move in this direction, which has four components to it. The first, straightforward, integrate the financial system better. Code for this, banking union. Banking union with all its ramifications is now going ahead. The second was to revise the budgetary framework. The code for this could be fiscal union. The third was closer coordination. This is a bit more amorphous. Could we call it coordination union? Or is it really what Article 121 said in the first place, or Article 136 of the treaty, which is closer coordination between the member states' policies? This is the third component. The fourth I'll leave to Vivien, but it's in there, democratic legitimacy and accountability, which could be code for political union. So I won't elaborate on that, knowing you need to talk about it. Yet, in spite of what seems to be consensus that these are the four directions in which things need to go, as always, you see differing interpretations, different sequencing, different ideas about what should be given most weight at different points, as usual between France and Germany. Germany would like to see political union before they even contemplate fiscal union. That way you put pressure on delinquents, especially in southern Europe. François Hollande would like to see fiscal union being put in first, but he doesn't want to forgo political power. And other countries tend to line up on one or other side of these kinds of arguments. In addition, what all of this implies is a very considerable deepening of the governance at European level. What it's saying is essentially that fiscal power is going to be taken away relatively from member states and assigned to the supranational level in ways that we've not really been used to in the past. And this is back to my only moment, because I want to argue that there's something afoot here which is very fundamental in the governance of the European Union, or particularly the euro area, that is sucking in other countries as well. So what do I mean by this? The first is that we are, I think, seeing rules winning. If you regard rules and discretion as polar opposites, rules seem to be gaining in ascendancy. Now, whether this is order liberalism's triumph or some other interpretation of rules, it is happening. We're seeing power shifting. Now, if you consider what the European Commission is giving itself, I think the airflow will dissipate in a moment, so we wait with the projector. What we're beginning to see is a succession of new powers being given to the European Commission. It has this European semester, which we've just gone through, and we see one episode of this where what's known as the country-specific recommendations were issued in May, part of the European semester, telling countries what they need to do to redress their positions. Immediately, an objection from François Hollande, one of the supporters of it, or at least France is one of the supporters, saying, you can't tell us what to do. You can't tell us that our budget is in the wrong direction or that we're not doing enough for structural reforms. But that's precisely what this governance reform is intended to do. The other bits of the fiscal compact, part of this, the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance, that too creates new powers of oversight and eventually of imposing sanctions on countries. And I don't know how many people know this, there's a shift to what's known as reverse majority voting, which sounds a bit like something you do in a skating rink. Reverse majority voting means that instead of voting to accept something, you have to assemble a majority to oppose something. And what you're opposing here is the recommendation from the Commission to sanction a member state for having either an excessive deficit or an excessive imbalance. It shifts the burden of proof, if you like, and makes it more likely that a recommendation from the Commission will be accepted. So all of these are power shifts, some would say power grabs by the European Commission level. Now, Habermas, in a number of recent papers or variations on the same paper, has condemned this as the assertion of executive federalism, something that he deplores greatly, and says that no, what we need is input legitimacy. So we can get that to Vivien, one of her favourite topics, or maybe the throughput legitimacy argument. In parallel, what we have to countenance, both at European level, even global level, are various incompatibilities. You can't have free movement of capital, free movement of exchange rates, and common inflation rates. You have Danny Roderick's global trilemma. All of this is leading us, or the quartet refers to Pados Gilbert, who added free movement of goods and services within a particular area. You can't do this easily and retain all your autonomy in governance. And one recent example of this is that if you lose democratic control of fiscal policy, it's because you need the executive federalism element to it. And in a recent paper by Ben Crum in the last issue of JCMS, you see that he puts this forward. There's one choice, a more efficient EMU, one which is democratically legitimate, or a collapse. That's as starkly as he puts it. I don't quite agree with it, but nevertheless, that's the direction in which these governance trends are heading to. In addition, you see in many, many countries now, fiscal councils being set up as independent agencies to monitor what government does. Our fiscal councils have differing ways of being set up. One is to say, we recognize that politicians are always sort of a deficit bias, so we need some independent input to this to prevent that deficit bias causing too much difficulty. They vary. You see a very powerful one in the Congressional Budgetary Office in the US or the Central Planning Bureau in the Netherlands. The British Office of what is called the Budget, OBR, responsibility, yes, responsibility, good word to call it, isn't it? That's another one which is independent from government, produces the forecasts. Their role is advisory. There isn't as yet a fiscal council which sets fiscal policy, decides on fiscal policy, but that's the drift in which it's going. Controlling official forecasts, maybe being responsible to the legislature rather than the executive, and perhaps doing things ex ante, saying here is the position before you take decisions, rather than the kinds of audit office which monitor what public finances have been after they've happened, and therefore have no real influence on the decisions when they're taken. So fiscal councils are moving in all these directions. They require good analysis, they require staff, and this is one of the difficulties that some fiscal councils have had. One's been effectively neutered, and that's the Hungarian one, which was set up in great fanfare to deal with Hungary's fiscal problems. And then when Orban's government came in, it's one of the first things they did was to disagree with the fiscal council and therefore neuter it. So it's a politically difficult one. It is different, very different in context from what a monetary policy committee does, or the governing council of the ECB, because it's not taking the actual decision. So you can't think of this as a principal-agent relationship. But it does mean that governments do have to take account of fiscal councils, because they can impugn their reputations. They can lead to a lesser credibility in markets. This is exactly what's happened in Hungary. If the fiscal council says do A and the government does B, then markets will look at this askance and say you're doing the wrong sorts of things. So I think what we're seeing is fiscal councils becoming something quite significant. Add to this fiscal rules, and this again is the DG ECFIN estimates. Once the airflow goes, you can see that from 1990 there were very few fiscal rules in place, 1991, and you see a gradual accumulation of fiscal rules covering different elements. The top bar is rules on revenue, the second one is rules on debt. We've seen spread of the German Schuldenbremse to other countries. So it looks as though that the trend is to have even more rules in future. So to put all this together, I thought I'd invent a new phrase for you. What we're seeing is the invention of the EU level as the what I call the expendatory state, hence my only moment. Expendatory in the sense that what's happening is that far more is being put in place to constrain fiscal policy. So it's not just the shift to the Commission level. It goes beyond that. And the airflow will go away. I'll show you the chart. Go.
Can someone check the airflow?
Yeah, right.
Well, Stuart, you can sit there and blow on it. So what's missing from it? Go away. All right, well, the box at the top reads, I can see it on here, Commission oversight and sanctions, fiscal councils being put in place in country after country, and fiscal rules being imposed, and all of this bearing in the box in the middle on fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, which we always thought of as something that defines what governments do, along with the army, is being more and more constrained by this combination of top-down pressure from Europe, plus these voluntary decisions to delegate some of the responsibility for it to other areas. So I want to argue that this is a fairly basic change going on in governance. It's not going to go away. So I'll come back to that when he wants to see it later. Now, back to my main topic, banking union. What we saw initially in banking union was a very difficult birth of what's called the single supervisory mechanism. It was something that was deeply contested amongst the member states. The Germans wanted relatively fewer banks to be covered by the new supervisory mechanism. The French at one stage said all 3,000 banks should be covered. I suspect the Germans might have been rather worried about the viability of the Landesbanken and Sparkassen in the way which led them to say, okay, don't look under the carpet too carefully. It's not clear that this new banking union is going to catch all the problems. I'll have to read out some of this, sorry. Some of the second-tier banks, which caused the most difficulty, were banks like Bankia in Spain, Anglo-Irish Bank in Ireland. Even in the UK, it was Northern Rock, a small bank. So just going to the biggest systemically important banks was not necessarily going to catch all the problems that banking union is designed to deal with. It's becoming a sort of federal system in which top tier sets the rules, oversees the biggest banks, and then delegates to individual member states to deal with the rest of them. But what it lacks, again, I have to read this out to you, missing elements. There isn't a common resolution mechanism. That's given up entirely. Can anybody get
trying to find somebody.
Okay, well, I'll just have to read out this. Sorry about this. We're missing a common resolution mechanism. We're missing EU-wide deposit insurance. Two fundamental elements of what could be a banking union. The things that are not going to work, not going to resolve the banking problems. And if you look at the European Council outcome of last week, you see that there's still a reluctance to go in this direction. Because, once again, it's about burden sharing. And my fear is that this form of banking union is going to lead to the same kind of flaws as we saw in the original design of monetary union, perpetuating a new set of problems, but failing to reach something comprehensive. Fiscal union, what is it? Well, I think we see broad agreement at European level on more intense fiscal rules. What we don't see, although we have a call for a European fiscal capacity is agreement yet on stabilisation as a function of fiscal policy. There is supposed to be, under these plans for genuine economic and monetary union, some new approaches to raising money, possibly with a stabilisation function, but not very clear how it will be funded, how it will be spent, how it will be administered. What we don't have, almost certainly will not have, is cross-border transfers. That's the definition of fiscal union which Germans understand and deplore, because only 3 Länder pay in and 13 Länder receive from the Finanzausgleich. But there might be temporary measures. And we see continuing divisions on Eurobonds. Eurobonds might be seen as a way of dealing with this, but because of the tensions around them, concerns about burden sharing, Eurobonds simply aren't going to be the crisis resolution mechanism or even something to expect in the next year or two. So to me this raises a number of fundamental challenges. We don't yet know where burden sharing is going. Burden sharing is the key to this. Working out how to share burdens for risks as well as for cash flow is going to be central. There isn't an EU level taxpayer. That might sound like a crazy statement, but we pay tax nationally, we don't pay tax at European level. Many of the things such as banking union require a taxpayer backstop, because banks have to be resolved, somebody has to pay somewhere. And this, I think, gets in the way of debt mutualisation, the absence of European level taxpayer. EU rules, we see contests going on between solidarity and discipline. Moral hazard repeatedly coming into the game. The reason that the Germans are so reluctant to lend money to the Greeks is moral hazard. Make it easy for them and they'll just continue with delinquent behaviour. And we do have a question about the numbers game. 17 euro area members, 8 signatories to the fiscal compact outside the euro area, 2 not signing, the Czech Republic and one other, and now Croatia, where they're going to sit on all of this. So how do you shape the mandates? How do you get compliance? So I'll conclude with 3 final thoughts, since I'm just about on time. The first, I think most politicians now get it. We don't have leadership, and we have to beware of populists. Second broad conclusion, the crisis isn't over. The crisis is continuing to shape the way things are changing in governance. And national differences are perhaps the hidden concern in all of this. The disparities between countries are widening, and that's going to shape what happens next. But I would now argue that Brexit, Greek exit, and an unravelling of the euro are far more distant prospects than they were even 6 months or a year ago. Third broad conclusion, we need growth. I don't think anybody queries that we need growth. The most austere European central banker doesn't dispute that we need growth. But it's how to share burdens and achieving it is critical. And one of the things that is bound to come up in this regard is a way of dealing with the overhang of debt. Greek debt, maybe Portuguese debt. Some form of debt redemption is going to happen, whether it's that proposed by the German Council of Economic Experts, or kicking into the long-term future like a war loan in the UK was in the 1950s. These are the sorts of solutions that will need to be found, but something will have to happen. Maybe a Marshall Plan, or perhaps call it the Merkel Plan for Southern Europe. My last observation was I was going to show this to you, but unfortunately I've been thwarted. My variation on an old joke. Economics is the only field in which 2 people can receive a Nobel Prize for using impenetrable mathematics to prove mutually exclusive propositions. Thank you.
I'm talking about the future of the Eurozone, and I'll be a little bit more polemical than Iain, and talk about economic liberalism versus European democracy. So I'm going to be doing both, do a little bit of the economics, as you'll see, and then move. So what future for the Eurozone, and this is what I'll be talking about. Of course, it depends. But it depends, and I think that's important. Iain didn't really touch on that except more tangentially. What are the political economic ideas that influence the policy? And so we're talking about austerity hawks versus pragmatists. I could have called it austerians, but I suppose that's with that. We'll look at political economic structures, policies, and results. Then I want to turn to the political institutions, the treaty-based obstacles to action, also issues like the unanimity rule. Then I want to focus on leadership, because I think that's important. Iain also focused on that to some extent. But it's about the hesitancy of EU leadership, the lack of EU vision, and lots of failures in the communicative discourse of the public. And then I'm going to talk about democratic legitimacy issues. Input and output, which are the general terms for such legitimacy, but I'll be introducing a new term, throughput processes. So it's not just input politics and output results, but it's also throughput policies. And I'll be talking about the EU's governing by the rules and ruling by the numbers, which was so nicely illustrated by Iain's graph on the numbers of rules that we've seen across Europe. And then I'll end with asking questions about the future. This is actually EU-topia or dystopia EU. I did a piece for the German Marshall Fund about a year ago, with different possible scenarios, and I eliminated the scenario of breakup, because that's no fun. Nor is dystopia, mind you, but in any case, so that will end with that. So first I want to look at the clash of ideas. And needless to say, for the most part, austerity rules. And it's neoliberalism, ordoliberalism, it's Germany, it's the ECB, it's the Commission to more or less extent, depending upon which one we look. And how they define the problem is it's all about public sector profligacy. It helped get Greece started out in terms of the problems. And that in a way set the discourse, but it's public sector profligacy, lack of discipline, excessive deficits, macroeconomic imbalances, the lack of competitiveness. These are the words that get used over and over and over again to define the problem. And the solution has consistently been, no, we've got to have rapid deficit reduction, rapid debt reduction. It's about fiscal consolidation, financial stability. It's all these various stability pacts. I'll go into those later. All the various pacts. And for Southern Europe, it means wage deflation primarily, on the assumption that prices will also go down. It happens in many countries. And it's all about structural reform. So that's, on the one side, the Austerians. And on the other side, we have a group that I'm calling pragmatists, for lack of a better word. I could call them neo-Keynesians, but the truth is, no one is really a neo-Keynesian anymore. There's a bigger mix. It's more complicated. You call them non-neoliberal, but that's also, it's the US, it's Obama to some extent, it was Brown in the UK, it's the US Fed, it's the Bank of England to some extent. Is it the IMF? Probably. Much more pragmatic. And what's the problem? Well, they focus on the global financial crisis. It's private sector debt, not public sector debt. It's the markets, it's the Greek crisis, it's a lack of liquidity of the banks and all the problems that Iain was talking about. And what's the solution for the pragmatists? Very different. Yes, deficit reduction, but much, much, much more slowly over time. Any American will remind you that the U.S. has never cut its way out of debt. The deficit has always grown its way out. And it's always taken, it has always taken a longer time in terms of slower debt reduction. It's about investing in growth for the solutions, and of course it's the Euro bonds, the ECB as lender of last resort, banking union, a European monetary fund, a European investment bank to use for investment, social solidarity. I'll come back to these later, but this is, so what you've got is very different sets of ideas and very different discourse about what kinds of solutions. Who wins in the EU? It's of course the austerity hawks. And what's the question? How do we explain why they win? Well, some people might say it's power, certain big countries. But I have a project, Simon mentioned this in the introduction, co-edited book with Mark Thatcher, some of the contributors in the room, Colin, A and Andrew Gamble. And here we try to explain how do you explain the resilience of neoliberal ideas. And we have 5 lines of analysis. I'm not going to go through them, but one is the adaptability. There's always, I use the metaphor, you cut off the head of the hydra's head and 2 new ones pop back up. And in a way, there's sort of always new ideas about how to be neoliberal. The next is rhetoric versus reality. You talk a good game, but actually you don't implement. Or you implement, it fails, and then you back off. And then there's a new generation of leaders who said, well, we've never implemented. It's the predominance in the discourse. It's the strength of the discourse. Or maybe it's just the weakness of alternatives. And in this crisis, I have to ask, where are the social democrats? Nowhere. Where are the new ideas? So in a way, it may not be that neoliberal ideas are strong or ordo-liberal. It may be that alternatives are weak. But of course, it's also about actors' interests, i.e. actors using neoliberal or ordo-liberal ideas strategically for the benefit of their interests. Obviously, the banks are very happy that they've been bailed out, and the bankers going off with their bonuses constantly. It's, this is about interest. But there's also, very importantly, the idea is institutionalized in the rules. And that is tremendously important for the Eurozone crisis. This is about path dependence of governing by rules. Starting with the Maastricht Treaty, the Stability and Growth Pact, and then on to each of these pacts, which simply reinforce, reiterate governing by particular kinds of rules, ruling by particular kinds of numbers. And very difficult to change. Best example is Hollande in his campaign, presidential campaign in France, saying, we want growth, we don't want this fiscal compact, and the minute he comes to power, he signs up, and what does he do? He has a discourse of austerity. So, the talk may be good, well, here's the rhetoric versus reality, but in reverse, it's the reality without the rhetoric, but that's always been France. Anyway, we won't talk about this. Okay, so what's important is what I want to do now is just very, very quickly go through some of the numbers to demonstrate that the austerity discourse, or austerity ideas about what the problems are, not correct. And if you look here, the problem is not public sector profligacy. Yes, these were at a high number. We're talking Greece and Italy, but still, they weren't going up. It's not about public sector profligacy in these particular years. And they go up, obviously, as debt to GDP goes up when they start rescuing the banks and start with austerity. The problem is actually, this is a slide from Stefan Collignon, which I find very useful. The problem is output loss because of austerity. Look, this is the US. The red line is potential GDP. The blue is actual GDP. The US, after a blip, actually tracks its potential GDP pretty well. This is the Euro area. And you can see it's not doing so well. But Germany actually manages to track it pretty well. It comes back up very quickly. But look at Italy. Its potential GDP isn't great. It's not going up anymore. But look where its actual GDP is. Greece, it's a very sad story. And Spain as well. So this is about austerity. It's a problem of output loss. It's lack of investment as well. I have a slide if anyone wants to see lack of investment in the euro area. But of course, as we all know, competitiveness is a problem. But one has to think about this also. The competitiveness problem is comparatively more because of German wage restraint across the 2000s. There are a whole range of reasons for this in terms of when Germany came into the euro, etc. I'll leave that if anyone wants to discuss it. But it's true that that southern wage inflation was pretty serious. But its price inflation was also pretty serious. And how do we explain all of this? Well, there's also a problem with the current account imbalance. As Northern European surplus countries lent and sold products to the south. So all of this flows south, and it fuels the deficit. So here's your surplus Germany. Down here, we've got Spain. And no question that this is a problem. But what I keep trying to emphasize is there's been very much a problem in the way in which the Eurozone crisis has been discussed, is that it's all country focused and no one is thinking, or relatively few people are thinking about the interdependence of the problems. You know, it's not, as Merkel said, we Germans save, and it's about lazy Greeks. Well, Germans save, and therefore German banks had to find some outlet for those savings. Yeah. And they fueled the Spanish construction boom. I think that's really an important piece of the puzzle, but that's not what's being discussed. Beyond this, okay, of course we do have to talk about the structure of EMU. And this is a slide that I really like. This is Latin American countries. This is optimum currency areas. This is Latin America. This is the UK and English-speaking offshoots. This is all countries on Earth at the 5th parallel north latitude. This is countries beginning with the letter M. And this is Europe. This is EMU. So to give you a sense of whether this is, could be a structural problem, well, okay. But one might want to respond, well, but the US doesn't have that problem. Well, there's a good reason for that. The US has a fiscal union. There are transfers. There is redistribution. And I think that's really part of the problem. When you've got this much disparity, and note that the US isn't part of that, it's a nation state, et cetera, but the US would probably be here too. We've got Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera, Missouri. I won't mention the European equivalents. But basically, there's no question that there's a problem with the structures. So it's a problem with structures and policies. EMU, there's no E in the EMU. There's not the economics. This is not an optimum currency area. But there's no fiscal federalism. There are no automatic stabilizers, meaning unemployment insurance, pensions that go across, and on. And that's what makes the U.S. work reasonably well. And of course, another problem is for EMU, and Iain talked about that, so I won't, but the big banks, not simply too big to fail, but too big to bail. And there was no EU-wide TARP, as there was in the U.S. The EU did not clean up its banks. It was rather schadenfreude, the U.S. is bad, we're good, we don't have any problems. Well, the result is each country had to bail out its own banks, and that was a problem. ECB, one size fits none inflation targeting, produces no convergence, only growing divergence in member state economies, and increasing deficit and surplus. We'll come back to this one size fits none, but I want you to know that it is now even used by the ECB. Jörg Asmussen in a recent talk, I think in response to, for the German Constitutional Court, explained why he had to intervene, and it's because one size fits none. So, but national governments, as I just mentioned, also have to rescue the banks, and their national banks, and that fuels sovereign debt crisis. So it's about austerity, to sum up, it's about output losses, current account imbalances, and the resulting recession that comes from austerity. And importantly, and this is what, when we're just looking at EU institutions, ECB, et cetera, we're not thinking about what's happening in the South. It was a debt crisis. Now it's a very, very serious competitiveness crisis, because big questions as to whether, given the kinds of cutting that they're going through, they can ever get back out of it. Because there's no investment in education. No, instead they're cutting. There's no investment in training. There's no investment in public investment in R&D. None of the sorts of things that your infrastructure, the sorts of things that one expects if you're going to pull yourself out of a recession. Of course, some people will say that this sounds very Keynesian. Yes. But there's a social crisis going on. And of course, we have no Eurobonds, although that's been being discussed for the past 4 years. No European Monetary Fund. Well, now the ECB lender of last resort, but only as of 2012. And even there, it adds conditionality to it. Banking union, well, there's a lot of talk about it, but we still have yet to see it. And we've got the lost generation. This is very serious in terms of youth unemployment and a downward economic spiral. Okay, but it's not just a problem of the economics. It's also in the structures and policies. It's also a problem with institutions. The EU is multi-level, it's multi-form, it's a three-level game. I would say it's a three-level or simultaneous discursive game because everyone is talking to one another at the same time. You can't even separate the levels. And when Merkel's in the council, she's also thinking about her electorate. She's talking she's thinking about the Constitutional Court, and of course she's dealing with everything else. So it's a complex decision-making process. There's a dizzying array of institutional actors and the processes as well. And let's think about the Eurozone crisis. This was uncharted territory in terms of the rules. But, you know, what's interesting is the EU did muddle through. I think Iain was right to be somewhat optimistic there. There's no bailout clause. So why is the Greek bailout at such a punishing level? Well, because this isn't a bailout, because we're having it at market rates. So you conform to the treaties, but you actually save Greece. The EFSF is a loan guarantee because it's justified by the danger of contagion. There's right after the no bailout clause, but you can intervene in cases of natural disasters. Well, contagion was an unnatural disaster, and therefore you can justify the EFSF. One can go on with this. The ECB was not allowed to purchase government debt directly, so it buys on the secondary market, then it lends to banks, and then it promises to do whatever it takes. So again, very innovative way at reinterpreting the rules. But of course, some rules are tremendous obstacles to action. The unanimity rule, so that's why the European Financial Stability Facility was done through multiple bilaterals outside the treaties. This was the first, the European Stability Mechanism came with a treaty amendment, and that was a real gamble. Merkel pushed it. Fiscal compact, the UK vetoes, so 25 buy-in outside the treaties. But the rules as being an obstacle to action. Now, even if you wanted to, how could you change the stringent pacts and compacts? Okay, so it's also a problem of leadership. It's really a lack of EU vision. Wolfgang Münchau had a really nice op-ed maybe 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, talking about the small state mentality. He was thinking about Van Rompuy as a Belgian, really only thinking about Belgium. And therefore, it's small states in the global economy. It's pity that Peter isn't here, because this comes from him. Small states in the global economy, what can you do but tighten your belt? But Germany is not a small state. But it has the same kind of small state mentality. And the EU is a global giant. Think about the way the US responded to the crisis. Immediately, we've got to move beyond this. We have to essentially spend. We have to have a stimulus because otherwise everything goes to hell. The EU is a global giant, but it acts like a pygmy, or thinks of itself as a pygmy. On top of that, ideological and country blinders. It's about ordoliberalism in macroeconomic policy, which is neoliberalism with rules. It's also German, for example, German fear of fiscal transfer union. It's also the lack of EU vision has to do with each member state thinking about its own national interests first, especially the electoral interests. And it's about the discourse. Merkel in particular, in the run-up to the Greek bailout, instead of trying to prepare the public for the Greek bailout, instead basically goes along with the media feeding frenzy. Yes, it's about lazy Germans versus lazy Greeks versus we good Germans. So I'm going to give you, this is a little pause for a joke. What Merkel should have said, this ended up being on NPR, National Public Radio, but what Merkel should have said to get the public ready for this and to get a sense of interdependence. And what she should have said, that is, up until the Eurozone crisis from 2000, the Eurozone was like a bar on a never-ending happy hour. But, she's going to say, but although it may be true that the Greeks, the Irish, and the Spaniards were like drunkards on a binge. Who were the bartenders? German banks, French banks. So in alcoholism, this is codependency. In economics, this is interdependence. See, now, had she told her constituencies, maybe without too much on the drunkards, because I know that's not exactly politically correct, but okay. Had she had a discourse about economic interdependence, about we're all in it together, and that Germany has done very well, it needs the euro, etc., but she doesn't do that. It's about poor decision making that creates panic, and I'm not going to go through this. Iain already went through much of this, but I think it's important to say, to show that each time it's actually it's not taking decisions, it's hesitancy, and it's also the discourse that actually fuels market panic. This is a slide by Eric Jones to demonstrate that actually the markets were very, very patient, waiting for the Eurozone leaders to make decisions, and the Eurozone leaders don't, and finally, and the rates keep going up and up as markets respond to the politics of it all. Okay, but what about democratic legitimacy? And this is where I want to focus on what are the problems of this kind of political economy for issues of democracy. And so this is about EU one size governing by the rules and ruling by the numbers. So if we consider legitimacy in systems terms, and I use this only because much of the discourse, much of the literature in political science, political theory, political philosophy, well, not political theory, has been about input and output. It's about input politics, it's about citizen representation and citizen participation, and then output. And if you think about the history of discussions of the EU and legitimacy, it starts with output. It's about output policy ideas and results. It's so long as everything, as the EU delivers, we don't need any input. This is the permissive consensus of the past. But okay, that's actually shifted, and now increasingly with the constraining dissensus, there's been a recognition by everyone you need more input. But basically, the whole discussion is input versus output. So what I've done is said, but wait a minute, there's something that goes in on that black box of government, that we should call throughput. And people have, scholars have theorized about issues of the efficacy of decision making, about the transparency, the processes, about openness and accessibility to interest groups. All of that's gone on, but they haven't put it together. I thought it'd be useful to put together a concept like throughput to pull those in for governance processes. But when you do that, what you find is what's interesting is that there's generally a trade-off between input and output. You have no input, no citizen participation in decision making, but the results are good and it's legitimate, the decision, the policy. Similarly, if you have lots of citizen participation, representation, and the results are terrible, it's still legitimate because that's what the citizens want. Okay, what about throughput? Part of the problem I see in the EU at the EU level is, in particular in Commission, et cetera, there's an assumption that somehow throughput can substitute for input because there'll be good output as a result. Or actually, this is not just the Commission. Generally speaking, there's that sense. And the problem is that throughput processes, it doesn't matter how good the processes are, they're not going to make up for no input, no participation, however good they are. And they're not going to make, they're not going to necessarily make the output make up for bad output. But what's interesting is bad throughput, if it's oppressive, biased, playing favorites, actually taints both input, i.e. any kind of citizen participation or involvement in the system, and of course taints the output results. Because if the processes were wrong, then can we really trust that these output ideas are wrong? Okay, so that's background. So at the EU level, it's all about output policies without politics, because you don't have the regular right-left politics at the EU level. And what we see is these output policies are about tax that are increasingly stringent on the rules and restrictive on the numbers. EU-level throughput processes for apolitical policy, well, you've already seen one of these, but so it's ECB, one-size-fits-none monetary policy as you get inflation targeting. For the European Council, it's one-size-fits-one governing mode, and you can guess who the one is. We'll get back to that in a minute. The Commission is one-size-fits-all numerical targets, and the European Parliament has no size, especially in the Eurozone. I'll get to the specifics briefly. And then what we have is national input politics without policy. In fact, what's happened for the national level is as economic policy decisions in particular have moved increasingly up to the EU level, national politics has been voided of substance. So there's still lots of left-right politics, but there's not the policy substance on economic policy. Well, other things move in. Let's be anti-immigration. Let's get more law and order, a whole range of things that have become the focus of that. But as a result, democratic legitimacy is in question, in particular at the national level. So very quickly, EU output policy without politics. What we see is that output policy ideas, they're ordoliberalism, it's the Brussels-Frankfurt consensus, and that's the ordoliberal level, but it's also neoliberal internal market policies focused on structural reform. And of course, the narratives of public profligacy. The policy discourse is also very apolitical. These are technocratic decisions. This is TINA. There is no alternative. And in fact, it's only once Monti and then Hollande start saying, wait a minute, where's growth in this? That people started saying, yeah, maybe there's something political about this. Maybe there is an alternative. But then, of course, Monti and Hollande promptly went about doing the same austerity policies. So what are the results? They don't work. In particular in those countries that are most in trouble, as we see from all of these countries moving into recession. Monti's Save Italy program and then Grow Italy is a good example of that. First, he does Save Italy, and you cut across the board, and you cut pensions, and you cut public sector pay, and then you expect growth, and you expect the population to be in agreement with structural reform. It didn't work, and it hasn't worked in most of the countries under conditionality or under threat conditionality. Okay, but what about the throughput processes? This is more fun. Okay, the ECB, but ECB is really interesting because it goes from a focus on one-size-fits-none throughput rules to whatever it takes output results. Instead of being so focused on the rules, what you see is ECB actually, the hero of the story to a certain extent, says, wait a minute, what's our mandate here? Is it credibility, which is what Trichet and Duesenberg did? Just focused on the rules, doesn't matter what the results are, the output results, because it's about the rules, and that will ensure our credibility. Or is it about output results, whatever it takes? And I think what you see in the ECB under Draghi is, our mandate is to maintain the euro intact, and in order to do that, it's whatever it takes. Now the council, one-size-fits-one throughput rules against the community method, which is more input, not much, but the European Parliament is involved, or output growth. And what's interesting about this is that the Eurozone governance has been an extraordinary increase in intergovernmentalism, excessive intergovernmentalism, no real input politics, despite the fact that the council members all say, we are representative of our people. Therefore, this is the most democratically legitimate way to run things. You've heard Merkel do this, Merkel talk about this in 2011 when she said, I rather like this European Union method, and it's quite good. And Sarkozy basically out and out said, this is the most democratic way when I, representing the French, make these decisions. He would say But the problem is, so, you know, they're indirectly representative, their populations, therefore they're most legitimate. That's the notion. Well, two things. One that I don't have up here is that they are legitimate to make decisions for their own populations, for their own citizens. But they're not legitimate to agree that they're going to impose conditionality of an austere kind on Greece, on Ireland, etc. But the second piece of this is that this is no representative institution for debate that they're engaged in the council. This is about hard bargaining. This is about power politics. This is about where that country that has the most credibility wins, and that is Germany. So it's the most powerful who decides. What's the remedy for President's report that Iain mentioned? If you look at it carefully on the democratic, that last point 4, what you see is all member states are to agree to sign contracts to follow the rules. What's the remedy? Elect the European Commission President through the European Parliament elections. This might enable the Commission President to have greater flexibility, so this is where everyone's going. What if the new majority wants more of the same? We're still in the problem. European Parliament, as I mentioned, is no size at all, with minimum input, weak throughput. And actually, interestingly, is the one chance the European Parliament had to put itself into the process with the six-pack, it pulls itself out, gives away its ability to review Commission action. So the European Parliament is all intent on electing a Commission President, but be careful what you wish for. Very quickly, national input politics without policy, it's all bad. What we see is cycling of national governments as citizens exercise their input at their national level. They don't make a difference at the EU level, so they make their views known at the national level, and you get increasing cycling of national government. The image of the EU, I have a slide on this, but I'll go very quickly over it, is the positive image of the EU has just gone down, and the negative image has gone up. And the Eurozone crisis has exacerbated Euroscepticism. It's the rise of Euroscepticism on the left, the right, and in the center. And it's the rise of the extremes on the left and the right, and in the center. But especially in countries under the Troika, in Greece, and we're seeing the rise of democratic governments. Who would ever have thought an authoritarian government in Hungary? These are all very, very scary signs to my mind. And of course, EU solidarity is at risk, rising poverty, etc. Unemployment is 66% for young women in Spain. So we're talking peripheral. So here are the slides. What you see is it was 50% positive image for the EU. It's down to 31, and it was 15% in 2006. The negative image is up to 28. It's almost a pincher twitch. Rise of Eurosceptics. Look at the middle. Finland, the Eurosceptics in the center. Out, way right and the left. So what will the future of Europe bring? Can we get the economics right? Can we get the politics right? Can we get the governance right? I'm going to give you two scenarios. One is utopia, the other is dystopia. The first is deeper economic and political integration for a flourishing utopia. The other is shallow economic and political integration for a stagnating dystopia. Don't ask me which I think it's going to be. Or maybe you do want to. Okay, utopia. And the EU is supposed to be up as well, but the spell check always changes. So EU-utopia, positive muddling through, output, everything we've mentioned. ECB, lender of last resort, but this time without the conditionality that it's imposing on Italy and Spain. If they need to be saved, it's Eurobonds, it's a banking union, it's EMF, it's project bonds. A looser monetary union, so that you can actually go out and then come back in. And if you've got your Eurobonds, banking union, etc., you will be protected. And EMF to go out and then perhaps come back. And I see that as the only way for these countries where it's only devaluation, which is completely unsustainable. Throughput beyond, or rather back from, rules-based governments, real gouvernance économique, that you can have yearly EMU targets for the different variety, and pay attention to the differences in the varieties of capitalism. Slower deficit reduction for those countries in trouble, with deductibility of economic and social investments. So don't count money for education, infrastructure, R&D, etc. And have supermajorities with opt-outs instead of being unusual. Talk about that later. Input more democracy via policy with politics. European parliamentary elections, yes, for the Commission President and for the Commissioners. Linkages between the European Parliament and national. A treaty reform via the convention methods, and then at the end, supermajority and opt-out. And all of this is a way to try and bring in more democracy. Dystopia, negative modeling through. Output is shallow economic integration. We have a lost generation. Southern European dependency on northern handouts. That is, if you do get, and you will get, the transfer union that Germany feared. And low wage Boucher mentioned this. The new China for Southern Europe, as China becomes better. Throughput, it's technocratic rule, it's more packed. So in the German Marshall Fund paper, I suggested that in dystopia, you then get the pact for stable growth, the super pact for sustainable stability, the super growth and sustainable stability pact. If you look at the names of various these, the rules as they are, okay, is a dystopia. And input, it's authoritarian tendency, tremendous political volatility. It's the triumph of neoliberal anti-democracy, non-majoritarian institutions, the Council and the Commission rule. Basically, national level democracy barely exists. The question, where's the Polanyian counter-movement, the neoliberal counter-movement to the post-war social democratic counter-movement to the classical liberalism before? If there is one, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be social democratic. It's about ungovernability with the extremes on the left and the right, maybe the center. Some countries turning fascist. This is my dystopia view. And there's going to be a council president election. As council leaders recognize that it's all that it's so bad, they're going to say, no, we need the election of a council president to legitimate. So who is the candidate? I have David Beckham. Only person with name recognition. If you remember Marx, first time tragedy, second time farce. This is about Napoleon, Louis Napoleon. Well, third time, I don't want to think about it. Okay, and thank you.